Paul Engel once said, "As the world shrinks, the need for translation expands." And this is precisely what is happening to the world today. This need for translation is felt in every city, in every corner. Take these peddlers, for instance. They are speaking French. They know a smattering of various foreign languages, German, Spanish, Russian, French, Italian, and many Indian ones too, enough to sell their wares. And then what about international conferences?
We have to decide what pre-project activities to be taken up or what project proposals to be taken up.
The credit for the success of these international conferences goes to the faceless voices behind those dark panes. They belong to the interpreters. Remove them, and the delegates might as well go back home without speaking a word.
D'un projet qui a déjà trouvé approbation. Ce projet attend les fonds qui ont été alloués par les pays européens.
And this need for translators is even more acute in a multilingual country like ours, and is especially felt in the nerve centers of our metropolises. This is Nehru Place, New Delhi, a very busy commercial center. Whenever I see a complex of this kind, I wonder, as I do now, as to how many languages are being spoken in the offices of this complex at this very moment. 5, 10, 15, 20. What's your guess? There are people out there from Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, Meghalaya, Nagaland, Kashmir, Punjab, you name it, from every part of this country, perhaps even from Nepal. They're all drawn here in search of livelihood. They got to work together, live with each other actually throughout the working day, talk to each other, be able to communicate with each other. How do they manage? For they all do. From Thambi in the canteen to the chairperson of a corporation, they all need to know at least one language other than their own, just to get through their working day. This is just a question of living together. But think of the problems if you're doing business with other parts of the country. You can't know all languages, but you need people who can help you to communicate better. The problem is further compounded when you think of international trade. In this complex, there are hundreds of companies which do business with foreign countries, which collaborate with foreign companies. We don't realize how interdependent we have become on each other in this world, even for the smallest things. This is increasingly a very small world, a small business community, a marketplace. And we need to know various foreign languages just to get our work done. It was once said that no man is an island. No man will ever be, not any longer. But what does this imply for the field of communication, and more specifically for the field of translation?
See, the translation has not as yet developed as a specialized subject in this country.
जिस तरह से पश्चिम में अनुवाद सिद्धांत का विस्तार हुआ है या उस पर चिंतन हुआ है, उस तरह से भारत में अभी हम लोगों को बहुत काम करना है.
Most of the books written on translation here are theoretical, and most of them are inspired by the Western theory of translation. In fact, we do need handbooks and manuals on translation which are of practical help to the translators.
Translation as a profession is gaining importance, and this is evident from the large number of translation bureaus coming up. Freelancing is also a lucrative profession.
Translation, which was a casual activity, an ad hoc activity, is now a very organized profession. It is now an industry.
Literary translation is not just challenging and exciting. In fact, it can be a very good paying career too.
With the Indian economy opening its doors to foreign investors and collaborators, the future of the translators seems to be a bright one.
In fact, the history of professional translation in India does not show a regular or systematic development. Most of the translators came into the field by accident rather than by choice and learnt its intricacies, not in institutes, but by working in the field. We spoke to Dr. Gargi Gupta, a pioneer in the field of translation studies, who also brings out Anuvad, a research quarterly related to the subject.
मैं अनुवाद के क्षेत्र में सन 63 से काम कर रही हूँ। सन 63 में हमने दिल्ली विश्वविद्यालय में सबसे पहले अनुवाद का पाठ्यक्रम शुरू किया। तो साल 1.5 साल पढ़ाने के बाद मुझे ऐसा लगा कि हिंदी में हमारे पास अनुवाद के सिद्धांत के संबंध में कोई सामग्री नहीं है। जो कुछ सामग्री हमारे पास उपलब्ध थी वो अंग्रेजी में उपलब्ध थी। तो विद्यार्थियों को हमारे बड़ी मुश्किल होती थी, अंग्रेजी की पुस्तकें उनको मिलती भी नहीं थी और उनको समझने में भी दिक्कत होती थी। तो इसलिए मैंने दिल्ली यूनिवर्सिटी के कुछ अध्यापकों के साथ, कुछ विद्यार्थियों के साथ और कुछ पत्रकारों के साथ, कुछ सरकारी अधिकारियों के साथ मिलकर अनुवाद पत्रिका शुरू की। और इस पत्रिका का उद्देश्य मुख्य ये रहा कि इसमें विद्यार्थियों से अनुवाद करके हम चीजें छापें ताकि उनको हम प्रैक्टिकल एक्सपीरियंस दे सकें।
That is an old story. For now, translation courses are being offered in various Indian universities, including IGNOU. What this hopefully means is that soon all Indian translators will be well-trained specialists. We have with us Upasana, who is doing a diploma course in translation, English to Hindi. Upasana ji, ये जो कोर्स कर रही हैं आप, इसमें आप सीख क्या रही हैं?
जहाँ तक सीखने की बात है, सबसे पहले तो मैं ये कहूँगी कि इस कोर्स में आकर मैंने 2 भिन्न भाषाओं की भिन्न प्रकृति, उनके बोलने वाले लोगों की समाजगत विशेषताओं और संस्कृति को जाना और साथ ही अनुवाद करते समय जिन कठिनाइयों का सामना करना पड़ता है और अनुवाद करते समय जिन आवश्यक उपकरणों और साधनों की ज़रूरत पड़ती है, उन सब के बारे में मैंने जानकारी हासिल की है।
क्या आप सोचती हैं कि आगे चलकर ये डिप्लोमा कोर्स आपके लिए उपयोगी होगा?
ज़रूर होगा, क्योंकि मेरी रुचि है अनुवाद में और मैं ऐसे बहुत से लोगों को जानती हूँ जो मेरे साथ ही कोर्स कर रहे हैं, क्योंकि हम सब जानते हैं कि अनुवाद का क्षेत्र बहुत व्यापक है। कोई भी क्षेत्र ले लें आप, आज पत्रकारिता है, विधि है, प्रशासन है, हर जगह आपको अनुवाद की महत्व और आवश्यकता का पता चलेगा। इसलिए मैं समझती हूँ कि इस कोर्स से मुझे ज़रूर फ़ायदा होगा।
Good luck to you. I hope you do very well in your career. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
One of the major tasks after independence was to reassert our cultural and linguistic identities. Our languages had to compete with English, which was not only the language of our ex-rulers, but was also the language of the technologies invading our shore. This terminology had to be indigenized to the extent possible to make our languages effective in the modern world. Translators had a great role to play in this. There are many efforts in this field, some of them perhaps clumsy, exaggerated, misguided, but most genuine and serious. The Government of India set up the Commission for Scientific and Technical Terminology to regularize all activity in this field. We spoke to Professor Suraj Ban Singh, Chairman CSTT, to learn about the activities of his department.
Can you tell us something about the functioning and achievements of the Commission for Scientific and Technical Terminology?
See, at the time of independence, we did not have enough books on science and technology in Indian languages. Therefore, in 1961, the Government of India established Commission for Scientific and Technical Terminology with the object to develop and evolve technical terms in Hindi as well as in Indian languages. The main idea behind this was to standardize the technical terms in the Indian languages so that there is no anarchy in the use of the technical terms. Since then, the Commission has developed over 5 lakh technical terms, and over 9,000 technical books in Indian languages have so far been translated and written. Now, in order to promote the use of the technical terms that we have evolved, we have set up a National Terminology Bank in which we intend to store 5 lakh technical terms, not only in Hindi but also in all the Indian languages. The main idea behind this is to enable instant dissemination and printing of the technical terms so that it is available to the people as and when they require it. The ultimate aim is to connect this National Terminology Bank with the computer network system of the National Informatics Center, through which it should be possible for us to take our words to the consumers direct throughout the country.
The task of the CSTT is not an easy one because English technical terms have gained currency with the Indian masses. They are far more familiar with the English terms than the Indian equivalents. Sri Vidyasagar Nanda gives an interesting example of the translation of technical material by a friend of his who insisted on pure Hindi. He translated, "Bring the knob to the starting locking position and tighten it as mund ko pashan sthiti mein lakar sangharshan kar dein." This is a great achievement for a pandit. But what about the mechanic who has to carry out the instruction? To him, a version like knob ko locking position mein lakar kas dein would be far more preferable. This brings us to the basic problem of translations. Who do we translate for, the pandit or the mechanic? In other words, what is the importance of the reader to the translator? Should he do a literal translation or a free translation? How much liberty can he take with the language? And ultimately, how successful can translation actually be? Or, to put it otherwise, is complete translation actually possible? The answer to these questions will depend on the nature of the material we are translating. There are two major kinds of translation, technical and literary. Let us take them up in this order. We take up the technical first because it is less complex.
Technical literature is easy to translate because most of the words do not display more than one meaning, and I would even say that their structures are relatively easy and routine. So translating technical literature into a technical language is quite a routine affair. Of course, I would even say that in trying to be routine, one should not leave scope for faults and should not indulge in faulty translation. By comparison, I would say that literary translation is more difficult because it shows a lot of variations of styles and other registers, and it's more difficult compared to technical literature.
There are some common traits basic to all technical material. 1. It has no ambiguity. One word has one meaning only and works at one level only, the denotative. Take, for example, words like reaction and catalyst in chemistry, article number so-and-so in the Constitution, wide, leg by in cricket, pneumonia, bronchitis in medicine. They all mean exactly what they say and nothing else to the professionals in these fields. 2. It is information-oriented. This implies that technical material is oriented towards a certain objective and is of a practical nature. It leaves no room for any kind of exaggeration, deviation, or confusion. 3. It is highly codified. It leaves no room for the play of imagination or fantasy of the writer or translator. Like a mathematical formula, technical material has a set and rigid code. It is for these reasons that machine translation, of which we shall speak later, has been relatively more successful with technical translation. Literary translation, on the other hand, is a different story altogether. Dr. Samuel Johnson was not the only one to think so. Even the greatest of translators have testified to a sense of inadequacy when faced with major literary works. Why is it so? Because literary translation is not the simple task of finding equivalent terms in a language for those from another. And because language is not a series of calligraphic symbols, but a living entity rooted in the soil and the cultural history of a people. It takes centuries to evolve its shades, colors, sounds, associations, in short, its personality. And because language and creative literature written in that language conveys a lot more to the native reader than what it actually says. How can you convey the particularities of a language, its unstated cultural assumptions, in a language grown on a different soil to a people with vastly different experiences? For example, how can you translate Eskimo literature for a Rajasthani? On the one hand, you have the expanses of ice, the bone-chilling winter, the sunless skies, and on the other, you have the sands, the heat, sun, and no water. A translator's venture in this area would be almost as unnatural and difficult as that of constructing an igloo in the desert. Or take, for example, some very typically Indian terms like Mang Bharna, Nazar Utarna, Shraddh Karna. Try translating them into English. How can you convey to a foreigner the hundreds of secondary associations that these seemingly simple terms have for an Indian? But yet, translation does take place, and good translation at that. In fact, good translators constitute a class of literary writers themselves and are recognized for their creative work rather than those of the writers they translate. We spoke to Professor Harish Naran and Dr. Manju Gupta about the difficulties involved in translation and ways to overcome them.
You see, in any act of translation, there are two major aspects involved. One is what we call as the formal aspect involving words and structures, and the other is what we may call as the content aspect involving meaning and message.
Dr. Manju Gupta specializes in linguistics and feels, quite rightly too, that a background knowledge of the functions of language as well as its structure is helpful in good translation.
The formal aspect which you have mentioned involves the structure of a language. For translating, one has to be fully aware of the dynamics of the language because all languages have their own pattern. Let us take a very crude example. In India, we drive on the left, but in most of the European countries, they drive on the right. Suppose a foreigner comes to India and he drives on the right side. Then what will happen? It will create chaos.
And there can be accidents in literary translation just as on the roads. You don't break your bones, obviously, but the joy of reading is lost. The clash between the foreign linguistic structure and this familiar structure of your own language makes you extremely uneasy. You just have to read a bad rendering of a foreign work in your own language to find out for yourself. When we come to the content aspect of literary translation, the scene is a lot more complicated. In fact, the content aspect provides the greatest challenge to the literary translator. This is because of cultural information and cultural gap, factors about which you already spoken. Let us look at them a little more closely.
In a piece of literature, be it a poem, be it a novel, be it a short story, words do carry a lot of cultural information, and it's the duty of the translator to transfer, to communicate, or even to transcreate that cultural information for his readers. The relative difficulty of transferring this cultural information will depend on the cultural gap, or what we call as the cultural distance between the two languages involved in translation.
How do you bridge this gap? There is no golden rule. Dr. Harish Naran, who has translated African literature into Hindi, gives us some examples and clues.
मैं नाइजीरिया की ईबो भाषा से एक बहुत अच्छा उदाहरण आपको दे सकता हूँ। ईबो भाषा में एक कहावत है जिसका अंग्रेजी में भाव ये है, The Aneka bird says that since men have learned to shoot without missing, I have learned to fly without perching. अब मैं इसको कहावत के रूप में ही अनुवाद करना चाहता था और बहुत इधर-उधर खोजा, कोशिश करने के बाद जब मुझे सूझा तो मैंने इसे ऐसे किया। एनेका पक्षी कहता है, तू डाल डाल तो मैं पात पात जम गया। मुझे लगा कि अनुवाद बहुत सार्थक हुआ है, लेकिन अनुवादक हर बार इतना खुशकिस्मत नहीं हो सकता। एक और उदाहरण है इबो ही भाषा से, एक कहावत होती है, When the moon is shining, the lame are hungry for a walk. अब इसके लिए मैंने बहुत इधर-उधर कोशिश की, कोई कहावत ढूंढूं, लेकिन कुछ नहीं मिला। अंत में मैंने इसका अनुवाद इस तरह से किया कि चांदनी रात में लंगड़े आदमी के मन में भी सैर को जाने के लिए लालसा जागृत होती है। पाठक को कठिनाई जरूर होगी इसके समझने में, ये मैं जानता हूँ, लेकिन अगर मैं खुशकिस्मत हूँ तो शायद हिंदी भाषा को एक नई कहावत मिल जाए। इसी का मेरा ख्याल अनुवाद की सहायता से भाषा प्रगति करती है।
Some interesting facts can be observed about the two examples given by Dr. Harish Naran. In the first, he takes a liberty to make a free translation to make the African proverb more accessible to an Indian reader. This reminds me of another excellent example of a translation into Hindi of Matigari, a novel in Gikuyu, an African language. A sentence in it reads, "Wake up, you zebra," he said. This sentence is translated by Asha S. Kanwar in Hindi as Ut Bhaise. And she says, as an explanation, that a bhaisa is far more familiar to an Indian reader than a zebra. This is another example of free translation, perhaps the type of translation best suited to creative literature. The second example given by Dr. Harish Naran is interesting because he makes a literal rendering of an African proverb and hopes that this new expression will find acceptance in Hindi language sooner or later. And perhaps he's right. For there are precedents to this. Take for example, Magarmach ke aansu bahana, which is well accepted, but is originally a literal translation of to shed crocodile tears. William Cowper synthesizes beautifully in a short sentence these two contrary types of translation, free and literary. He says that that translation which partakes equally of liberality and fidelity promises fairest. This is a very difficult task to achieve, but a very good ideal to pursue. And now let's take a brief look at future trends in professional translation. This may seem like science fiction to you, but it is where translation is heading with the help of computer technology. Clear your tabletops of all papers, dictionaries, pencils, erasers. Put a neat little computer there instead. It has the word power of various languages all at your fingertips. You don't have to search hard or long for equivalent terms now. You can choose, edit, delete, all within seconds. Work that used to take hours can now be done in minutes, and that which took days can be done in hours. We spoke to Mr. Ashok Verma, who runs a translation bureau using word processors.
You see, there was a time when all that a translator needed was pencil, paper, and a couple of dictionaries to work. Now times have changed. Computer has invaded all walks of life, and translators must have a computer now. Even United Nations regards ability to use a word processor as an essential qualification for a translator. From a casual ad hoc activity, it has become an organized profession. It is now an industry. We at TransTech are able to handle such large amounts of translation only because we work with computers.
We also spoke to Mr. Hemant Kumar of SoftTech, who is involved in the production of computer software for translators.
A lot of work has been done to mechanize the translation work as such. Word processors which provide Hindi-English capability are one such package which can be used for mechanizing the operations. SoftTech has developed a package called Akshar which fulfills this requirement. This provides the user with facilities such as keying in, creating document, updating it, retrieving it in both Hindi and English. It also has a dictionary which can be used by the translator to replace English words by Hindi words. It also allows a translator to reach standardization which otherwise will be difficult to reach.
In India, the computer is a relatively new phenomenon, but according to a specialist, the day is not far off when machine translation would have become a common feature of our lives.
As far as machine translation in India is concerned, very little has been done. In fact, computer culture came very late to India. But now IITs and some government agencies have done very useful work. And I hope in a few years we'll be able to catch up with the developed countries. Machine translation, though even in the West is in a developing stage, but Canadians, UN agencies, some of the UN agencies and EEC headquarters are using machine translation, and they get about 70–80% results for certain type of text like technical translation. In India also, I feel there is tremendous scope. We have excellent computer engineers and linguists, and in the year to come, let's hope we are able to catch up with the developed countries.
The attempt in terms of technology then is to find an effective substitute for the translator himself. But don't worry, there's always place for you, the translator, especially in the field of literary translation. For the machine most be only a useful aid to the translator, scientific or literary. We end this documentary on that note. Good day to you. How about translating that into Hindi?